G'day, welcome to another episode of the Fighting Men of Rhodesia series. My guest today is Dietrich Reyneke from South Africa. He was in the South African Defence Force and came out after 2 years at their equivalent of the South School of Infantry as a second lieutenant. And not long after that, he was posted up to Rhodesia and seconded to the Rhodesian Signal Corps. And he was there for over a year in 1974 and has some interesting anecdotes about what happened in that year and the things that he saw and experienced. Dietrich, welcome to the show. It's lovely to have you on board.
Okay.
Good. As we do in most of our talks, we just ask you to give a very brief overview of who you are, where you were born and raised, and how you decided or were called up into the South African Army.
I was born in 1951 in a town called Forest Smith. That is in the Orange Free State at that time. Then my parents moved to Pretoria and I attended school there, and then I went to a agricultural high school in Magaliesburg. That is in the northwest, I think. And then in 1971, I was called up to attend the military service as a national serviceman. At that time, I liked the army, and I've joined the army at 1 Signal Regiment, and I've done my 2 years initial training, mostly a little bit of started with basic training, then after that formative training, platoon weapons, platoon commander, unconventional warfare, and then the signals training to be able to be a candidate officer. And after 2 years, I was promoted to the rank of second lieutenant at the School of Signals, and I joined the organization called DHQ, Signal Squadron.
And did you choose to go into signals, or was that something that your heart set on?
It was random. They allocated you to a corps and you arrived there. Some people did go to other places due to their qualifications and so on, but mostly it was a random allocation, and in my case it was the Signal Corps.
I saw a documentary a few years back now of an American man. He had glasses on. He was high up in the State Department. He visited South Africa in the 70s, round about when you were in the army. And he was particularly astonished by the caliber of the South African signals equipment. I think at that time, I'm prepared to be corrected, but I don't think even the Americans had the signal, the frequency hopping radios that you guys had. Is that something that
that is definitely true, and there was like with the other equipment and the sanctions and so on, the development was quite fast to move out to do our own radio communications, which were in my time it developed, and we developed together with it, and we gave feedback how to improve it. In other words, we've tested it in the field, and then we gave feedback, they improve it, and then we eventually get the right equipment.
And can you briefly explain how that technology worked? Was if you're talking to somebody at another base, it's changing channels all the time or frequencies? How did it work?
Yeah, the frequency changing, and you have to synchronize it, and by talking and sync now and so on, and then the set tune in, and then you've got a frequency hopping. That was quite the advancement at that time.
And was that governed by some type of basic computer program, or what was the mechanics behind it?
Unfortunately, I cannot answer that because I'm not that technical.
Okay.
But it was developed by, I think, Raycall, together with the people of the Signal Corps, and they produced those sets for us, the TR-15 and so on.
It doesn't it never ceases to amaze me that how much South Africa achieved on the military armament side. You developed nuclear weapons virtually on your own. You had the 10th biggest arms industry in the world. You were self-sufficient in fuel. Made the most beautiful V-shaped vehicles on, the MRAPs and all that type of thing, which were only copied years later by other armies. And in fact, even to this day, if I'm not mistaken, the Marine Corps buys armor-plated vehicles from South Africa. Is that true, or have I gone on for the wall on that one?
Yeah, you see, when I joined in 1971, we were still using Saracens and those type of vehicles. But in that time, the RATO developed and all the other things developed. Our uniforms developed from khaki uniforms to the Nutria uniforms. It was like in the years 72 and 73, all of these changes immediately started to happen. And I was living it. And I think what happened is that we were given the prototypes. We looked at the prototypes. We've used it, even antennas for the radios. Jasco and other companies like that were providing us with all the new sort of equipment. We use it, we tested it in real time, give feedback, and then they adjust, and the equipment that we got worked well then. And it was a really good equipment as well. And
yeah, I was particularly impressed with your long-range artillery, the G5s, the G6s. They extended the range of the round by putting in a bleed base at the bottom of the round, and I think had the world record for a 155mm shell back then. But lovely equipment you guys produced. The rifles with the 20mm cannon or the 90mm gun. It was such a big weapon for that vehicle because, even in Germany in the Second World War, they were using 88, which was 2mm smaller than the 90 round. They were pretty big shells for those vehicles. I watched a little Noddy car firing at the Zambian bank using those shells, and very impressive destruction of the Zambian bank on the other side. But we're going off script here a little bit. But suffice to say, I've always been very, very impressed with South Africa's military. And unfortunately, it's slid down as it's happened everywhere. But now, going back to your story, you've now qualified as a signaller, the sort of equivalent of a platoon commander. And why were you sent up to Rhodesia? What was the reason given to
you? Actually, I was told that to go and command a signal troop, electronic warfare signal troop, and that was something that was adventurous. So I immediately said, yes, I will go, and that was actually the reason for me to go. But I didn't worry at that time much about why. The bigger scheme of things, it was the adventure, it was the opportunity to prove your leadership, because our initial training was very much focused on leadership, development, and so on. And that was a chance to prove that. And to have your own command at 22 years old, 37 troops, what a challenge. And that's nice. That's...
So you were embedded in the Rhodesian Signal Corps. I take it for granted that you actually wore Rhodesian camouflage and basically melded into the Corps.
Yeah, we were not allowed to take any SADF uniforms or anything like that. And when we arrived in New Salem, we went to the barracks and so on, where they issued us totally with all the equipment that we needed. I even got step outs, like we call it in the Army, your cap and your nice shirt and so on. And all the vehicles and everything was Rhodesian type of vehicles, Bedfords, which we know. So even the dog tags was Rhodesian dog tags. We were not allowed cameras and so on. And everything everything was like Rhodesian. It's not
Yeah.
anything else.
And was it voluntary to go up there, or was it compulsory?
I never thought about that. For me, it was a given. I was given an order and I went. It was not like I had maybe I had a choice, but I didn't know about it and I didn't think about it. So, yeah.
Let's face it, as a soldier, you're always wanting to test your own mettle and know whether you're capable of doing something. And it's always tempting to run where the action is. So how did you feel the first time you put on the Rhodesian uniform? Did you find it interesting, or, you know?
Yeah, I liked the uniform because at that stage we were just issued the Nutria uniform. So actually, I had my training was in overalls, khaki overalls, and so on. So it was the same at that time. Any uniform was fine. And but I like the brushstroke uniform until today. It's I think it's a very well-developed type of uniform, and we just melted into the system.
Yeah, the camouflage uniform itself, I think I've got this correct in saying it was developed by a lady who worked for a company that made clothing, and she sort of drew this camouflage and sent it to somebody, and I think the story is correct, and it's turned out to be probably in the top 5 effective camouflage patterns in the world. And I know when I was in the Zambezi Valley once, I sent some of my men down the riverfront, and they were all shorts and had camo tops, and it was really weird because their tops blended into the background so well that all I could see was legs walking, their lily white legs, you know. But it was very effective camouflage. So you were sent to Salisbury originally, were you, Diedrich?
Yeah, we were flown up with Dakota and landed at a place called New Salem, which was the Air Force part of the airport at Salisbury. And then I was picked up by the commander of V Troop, my predecessor, and we went to the barracks, get issue, and then we were transferred by a vehicle to Chirundu, which is just next to the bridge over the Zambezi, going to Zambia. So the base was situated there, and next to our base was a SAP base, because the police, South African police, was also deployed there, but we were not we didn't mix with them. Their base was just next to our base, and the only thing that we used of them was their movies. We've supplied the movie, and they've supplied the equipment to show the movie and the place. So that was
our international viewers might be wanting to know why South African forces were going into Rhodesia. It was principally, I think, because the ANC terrorists were filtering through Rhodesia down into South Africa to take on South Africa, which they would never have succeeded in militarily. But it became a sort of a joint force to look for them, as well as the ZIPRA forces that were coming in from Zambia. So tell us what happened at your camp there, what you did on a daily basis.
We were called Victor Troop. That's a part of a signal squadron of Salisbury, of the Army HQ, and our task was to monitor the frequencies of Zambia, all the frequencies available. We had also had a search task where we looked for new frequencies and so on, and we also had direction finding equipment to determine where transmitting was taking place from. And that was our 24 hours per day task. And now we've called it fixed tasks. That was all the known frequencies of police stations, military bases, and so on. and then it was search task. That was looking, operators looking for frequencies that is normally used for other things and maybe for terrorists, as we called them that time. And then the direction finding was to determine if there was transmission, where that transmission was coming from. We had also had a station in a place called Binga. I think it was, I cannot remember their troop's name, but we had a crossing when the transmission was done from Zambia. Then we activated the Binga station, and we activated our own direction finding, and then we plotted on the cross exactly where they were. So
how did you know about their standard frequencies? Had that been determined before somehow? I mean, you obviously had various frequencies that you knew. How did you know them? Who gave you that information?
Yeah, you see, the station was already running for a few years before I arrived there, and then it was already available. So we just carried on with our troops on the frequencies that was available.
Zambia being a former British colony, they obviously all spoke in English. Is that correct? They never went into Katanga or whatever their language was up there?
They used English as a language. I remember one thing on Sunday evenings, then all the police stations chatted to each other and giving the soccer results of the Sunday matches. And it was like Ndola United beat it, that one and so on. So it was English all the time. The army units used Slidex, sort of a low-grade code, and sometimes Morse code as well. But, the operators get so good that when a enemy operator moves from one base to another one, and he signs on the radio, sending a message or a situation report and so on, then the operators could immediately recognize his voice and say, okay, this guy was transferred there, and that one was transferred there, and so on. So because they listened to them 24 hours to all those frequencies that was available.
And how did you find new frequencies? Was it just a question of slowly turning a dial all 24 hours of the day, just listening, trying to find something?
Yeah, due to the high frequency HF, it was we used frequency prediction charts to determine which frequencies, because you will work on a lower frequency at night than in day. Say, for instance, 3770 or at night, and 55500 during the day, or even 6. We search the bands, and when we find a station, we listen, we write down what is the communications on that frequency, we log it, and we come back 2 days later or a week later again, check again, and see if anything has changed and so on. So it was like a bit of prediction, and then also search in general, and try. You use the most inquisitive signaler to man those radios, although it was on a shift basis as well. And we were looking all the time for terrorist type of activities, but they tend to transmit very short, and just get a message over and then get off the frequency. It's not like the fixed basis of the police or the army transmissions. So it was a very difficult task to find new frequencies that was worthwhile monitoring.
And did you have code breakers with you, or was that something that was sent further back to South Africa?
Yeah, we had now and then a person coming there, but we wrote down the messages in the code, and then we sent it to HQ do the code breaking. But some of with Slidex at that time, it was not the troops are very good because they started to break the codes, and then they write up the message down with the code, and then they translate it to an open one. So yes, but it's the standard of your troops that makes the difference.
Yes, that Slidex code, would it be similar to what we had, which was Shackle, where you have numbers on top and letters on the bottom? Is that how it worked?
Yeah.
Something similar to that.
Yeah, we also had Shackles. The Zambian army did use that as well.
Mm. And did you ever become aware of them monitoring you guys and listening in on you?
Not really, because we actually only have one rear link, which were a machine-based crypto type of rear link. We didn't use any transmission radios in the base itself. So, but we accepted the fact that it will be listened to. So every time a signaler transmit, he know somebody is listening and the tape recorders are turning. We were trained in that way. Keep it short as possible.
And of course, Russia supported ZIPRA, who Josh Nkoma's crowd in Zambia, and the Chinese more in Mozambique. Did you ever, even in those early days, the Russians were starting to become involved with all of their personnel that would come and give advice? Did you ever pick up any communiques between Russians there, either speaking in Russian or in English?
No, in my time, we did not got any of those.
Right.
The only thing that happened to us about in the middle of the year, a helicopter suddenly appeared over our base, and we were running for our rifles to shoot at it because it was a Zambian type of helicopter crossing the border. But I think what happened is that they came to take photos of the base, and before we could shoot at them, then they turned around and went away.
Yeah, I'd never heard of that before. Quite interesting that. And did you ever come across them messaging either ANC or other terrorists inside Rhodesia? Some of them did carry radios. Did you ever pick up a communication with terrorists in the country or passing through?
What I will say in this respect is that we had an intelligence officer with us all the time, higher ranking, but I was the commander of the base. But the intelligence officer were detached to the troop, and they scrutinized the immediate as the daily messages were written down. He received it and he worked through it. So basically, we didn't look at the intelligence part of it. That guy, which was normally a major or a captain, they did that interpretation of the messages before sending it back to HQ.
And did your guys or anybody even from South Africa ever use some type of jamming equipment if they tried to break communications in Zambia, or wasn't the war serious enough at that point in time to jam them?
No, we were only responsible for monitoring or receiving messages and so on. In other words, when a guy was transmitting, the tape recorders switched on automatically, and the operator writes down what he said on the radio on a special message pad.
Now, the major that was an intelligence officer, would he have been Rhodesian or South African?
He was South African.
Okay.
But
so you had no Rhodesians in your unit?
Yeah, he had links directly to the, I think, I'm not sure, but he had links directly to the Rhodesian Army HQ.
Right.
Because we were linked to the Army HQ.
Well, I've interviewed a number of South Africans, and I came up with this honorary title. I've been an honorary Rhodesian for serving in Rhodesia. So I bestow that upon you as well. Not as a joke, but as a sincere thank you to all South Africans who served in Rhodesia. And we've just had a 4-part series by Dr. Eric Lowe, who explained to us the political and military support and economic support that South Africa gave us. So, you know, from a Rhodesian, we're very, very grateful for what the South Africans did. At one point, you guys were paying for 50% of our war effort and 100% of the Portuguese effort in Mozambique. So that's a series worth listening to. What did you do for your time off, Diedrich? Did you go up to Kariba? Did you go back to Salisbury? What did you do for time off up there?
Yeah, the only time off that we did was going to Kariba. That was like maybe in 3 months' time. And then we played a lot of volleyball and so on in the base itself. So it was normally a 2-day excursion to Kariba, going on the houseboats, stayed in a hotel there, went to the dam, to the wall, and so on. But that was that.
And what did you think of Kariba? A lovely place, wasn't it?
Yeah, it was interesting. I still remember very well all the equipment that was used to build the dam, like the yellow type of bulldozers and so on. They were just left there on the side of Zambia. And when I was also there at one time, the sluices were opened. We even had the opportunity to see the power generating equipment inside there. And then the houseboats, we went on a trip on the houseboats with the elephants just nearby you, and the fishermen's catching fish and so on.
The place was paradise. Yeah. I've only seen 2 gates opened. I don't know how many you saw open, but boy, the whole wall shook from the massive volume of water passing through those gates. Very impressive. I think we've had too many droughts to open them. But going back to your time in your unit up at Chirundu, did you spend your entire year there, or were you transferred anywhere else, like to Bingo?
No, I just visit on a liaison visit to Bingo to coordinate the effort of the direction finding, but that was only once. Otherwise, I basically stayed at camp because at that time Gaddafi has also came to power. At that time, I remember reading the Rhodesian Herald about that and so on. It was quite interesting. Later on in life, when you were disposed of, then I thought about him starting that time that I was still there. So
interesting. Gaddafi was killed by the Americans because he was going to join the Russians and the Chinese gold standard rather than using the US dollar, and that's why he was knocked off. We've got him to thank for 10 tanks that we got out of him. He sent a shipload to Uganda, the T-55s, and the South Africans intercepted them somewhere near Durban and brought them into harbour. And 2 were kept by the South African Defence Force for analysis, and the other 8 or 10 were sent up to us, I believe, as tractor equipment on the labels, but we had barrels sticking out of the tractor equipment under the canvas. And so we're very grateful to end up having a squadron of T-55 tanks because of Colonel Gaddafi trying to help Idi Amin. But that's another story. Going back to your camp at Chirundu, did you have fairly comfortable accommodation, or was it just sleeping on a stretcher the whole time?
Yeah, we had proper beds. We were in bungalows, and just outside the bungalows there were bunkers. And we had in the morning at the first light, then we manned the bunkers, and in the evening at last light we also manned the bunkers. We called it stand 2. We had 2 generators running 24 hours per day. We had a nice kitchen and a dining hall, and a nice view outside over the Zambezi River as well. So, and then the volleyball that we played. So it was like It was like proper accommodation, and it was basic, but it was well built and so on. I
It was
remember,
like heaven. Don't you agree? That was a heavenly memory for you, I'm sure.
definitely. One night, we had a dog there called Shane, and it's like one of the troops. He was very attached to the dog, and he went to the bathroom at night, and the dog kept chasing him away from the entrance. And eventually he got his torch, and he had a look, why is this dog chasing him around? And then he found there a puff adder in the toilet entrance. So he was quite lucky that he had that dog. And we even had rattles coming at night, visiting the ash bins and so on. So
Yeah,
baboons coming sometimes through the camp as well.
yeah.
So that was also wildlife was around us.
Oh, I love that interaction with the wildlife. In fact, a snake in a toilet is a pretty good way of getting guys who are constipated to go to the loo, because that would really put the wind up you, wouldn't it? Did you ever manage to get down to the shoreline and do some fishing there? That you get some great catches there. I've fished there quite often.
Yeah, we were not allowed to go to the river. So it was out of bounds because of you will have only two people going down and so on. It was a bit dangerous to do that, we thought. Maybe when the people were to Kariba, they tried that, but not. It wasn't a daily occurrence with us.
I must admit, I get the impression as an expedition soldier that we were perhaps a lot more maybe gung-ho, or we just didn't care. We would go down and fish anyway. But I admire the discipline of the South African Defence Force. I've picked that up in a number of other conversations. Have you got any other story from that area? Did you ever pick up anything that was really valuable or interesting, communication-wise?
Not really. It was a very a disciplined type of work, because that signal troop must sit behind that radio for a shift, and then he's released, and then another shift, and so on. It's running a 24-hour type of operation. So maybe they were walking around in his shorts and so on, and the hair was long and so on, but it was very disciplined in terms of the work. And but other interesting things that were, there was a sugar estate with a landing strip nearby, and we had to clear the strip before a light airplane can come and land. So then we drove there with our Bedford with the sandbags and so on, and then we cleared it, and then they can land and so on. There was also a church there on that sugar estates, which was shot to pieces. It was so sad to see that actually the wall standing there with the cross and the rest, and the sugar growing everywhere and so on. And then Thetcher fly control was also very interesting. Those people were very disciplined. You couldn't get through that Thetcher fly control. You weren't able to bribe them or anything. They were very strict on Thetcher fly controls, taking your vehicle, spraying your vehicle, and so on. And yeah, it was quite interesting to experience that. I mean, when I was driving back from Salisbury on my Salisbury trips, then I will find elephants on the road, rhinos. I even found one time a black rhino, lions, and we could see them from our camp when we look over the river. Yes. So it was like wild Africa, and when you drive to Kariba, the wild animals were still there.
Beautiful.
Yeah.
Our foreign viewers may not understand why this tsetse fly thing. Tsetse fly carries a bacteria or something that causes sleeping sickness. So yes, the white settlers pushed the fly further and further north, right into the Zambezi Valley, so that the area closer to Salisbury could be farmed. And that whole area where the wild animals were still had tsetse fly in it, and they didn't want it to spread, hence spraying your vehicles when you went in. Sorry, you were about to say something. Carry on from there.
We were also very strict on malaria, because it's a malaria area, and troops believe that they cannot tan because of swallowing malaria pills. So you had to have a malaria pill parade and then pop the pill underneath his tongue and give him water so that he had to swallow it. So we had a weekly malaria pill parade. It's little things like that when you're older, you cherish those memoirs, actually.
Oh, fantastic. Did you have any interaction, daily, weekly, or otherwise, with Rhodesian guys that you chatted to or went to a mess and had a drink with or anything like that?
Yeah, the only people that I had an opportunity, or I was responsible to talk to the local BSAP special branch guy in terms actually of the security in the area, because they were working in civilian clothes around, and they pick up things that maybe can be harmful to us.
Yeah.
And then I had meetings with, but otherwise not.
What personal sidearms or weapons did you carry in those days? Was it the R1, your South African FN, was the most popular weapon? What did you have? Did you just
we had FN, and I had a 9mm Star pistol.
Oh.
Because I was driving to Salisbury often, on the Makuti Road and so on.
Right. Where did you stay on your trips to Salisbury? Were you put up in
KG6 barracks, the officers' barracks there?
Right, lovely. Gee, it sounds like a wonderful time that you had there, Diederik. Have you got any other story you'd like to share from that time of your life?
Yeah, it was basically, I was glad for the opportunity to be able to apply my leadership skills, because that was actually my first command, as this young lieutenant with 35 men and nobody interfering with you. And you had to keep the discipline and all those things without being a boss type of person and so on. So it was a good formative experience, and it's helped me in the rest of my life. At that stage, you didn't think about the danger, you didn't think about all other things, but it was like being in charge and doing a job for your country.
Yeah.
We never thought about the politics and so on. We just did the job. But it's good memories, and I remember it very well.
Fantastic. That's a priceless experience, because I was a lieutenant as well, lieutenant, and I was always under a captain or a major through the whole war, always telling me what to do. But only on one 6-week camp was I in charge of my own platoon, and it was up to me to delegate where the men went and all that sort of stuff. And I really enjoyed that, and I wish I'd had more opportunity to do that. So you, having been there for an entire year with this lone command, it must have felt like heaven, honestly.
Yeah.
How did you order your supplies, your food? Was that brought in by train to Karoi, and then you collected it from there?
No, we had a Bedford called Susie, I think. One of those old rounded type of Bedfords.
Yeah.
And we had a supply run, I think every 2 weeks, to Salisbury, to the barracks there, and then we received our supplies and so on.
Excellent.
And the food was always of a high standard. One of the national servicemen was appointed, or more than one was appointed as a chef, and we made sure that he did well, and we had a good time with food and so on, no problem.
So your food was fresh rations. You obviously took it back in a deep freeze.
Yeah, fresh rations, and also other type of rations as well, woolly beef and so on.
Oh, it's a pity you couldn't have potted the odd on antelope there to have a bit of fresh meat. But boy, that is such a privilege not to be able to eat rations from a pack all day.
Yeah.
Yeah. No, that's wonderful. So I think we've covered the Rhodesian side. Are you happy to leave it there, Dietrich?
Yeah, I'm fine with that.
Now tell us a bit. We'll go into maybe 20 minutes or so of your career from on there. After that, what happened when you went back to South Africa? Did you find it a bit of an anticlimax going back, or did you want to go back?
No, it was fine with me to go back because I was appointed as a lieutenant, as a squadron commander in Southwest Africa, in Windhoek itself. So that was also a good command to immediately go over to that squadron command. The squadrons became signal units. So in 1970, the end of 1975, and that was the time when the Angolan Op Savannah took place, started to place with all the Portuguese going out of Angola.
Yeah.
So I lived that through. I saw them coming in, and I had to provide the radios, even of my radios that was used for the commandos, because I was responsible for the communications in Southwest Africa, now Namibia, below Grootfontein, down to the south at the Orange River. So all the commandos, I was responsible for that, plus all the different citizen force units. There was a armored unit and so on, mobilization center, and my office was in the Eros airport. That was a military sort of establishment then. So that was also very interesting to be able to do HF comms, because Southwest Africa was HF, except for the shooting range and so on. So that was a quite exciting year. At the end of that year, I was transferred to do my further courses to Army Gymnasium Heidelberg. And I then went from there on. I was transferred to OFS Command Signal Unit, and then back to Army Gymnasium, where I eventually became the colonel there in charge of the Army Gymnasium. And then I was transferred to Pretoria Signals Formation, where I ended up as Chief of Staff of the Signals Formation at Wonderboom.
Wow,
So
it's quite a rapid rank increase. You went from full lieutenant up to colonel in what, maybe 5 or 6 years?
No. That was over a period of, let me see, I became a colonel when I was about 35,
Right.
36. So I had quite a training career at the Army Gymnasium, because I was training basic training. And then also I was the officer commanding of the officers training there, and the School of Signals eventually. So it was quite a period of time.
That period of time that you were in Southwest Africa, did you say you were at Windhoek?
At Windhoek, yes.
And what is your function there on a day-to-day basis? Were you once again intercepting messages for your South African troops?
I was in the provision of telecommunications and power supply. In other words, I established the communication. I maintained the communications for the commando units all over Southwest Africa, as well as to Army HQ in Pretoria, and then also the maintenance and repair of equipment, power supply for camps with generators, public address systems, battery charging, and a bit of training of the citizen force, and signalers of regiments and so on.
And the actual physical, mechanical methods that you used to get all those messages to your commandos, did you put up towers or something in areas that were guarded, or was it?
No, it was HF radios.
HF.
The radio was called the B16, which was a man-pack radio that was deployed at all the different commando HQs.
Okay, right. And so you just had to make sure that whole network was working.
Yes, it was implementing communications for the region south of Grootfontein.
Right.
One interesting thing that happened at that time, my signal store where all the equipment was kept was in a very famous building there called the Turenala. Now, the Turenala was a military place where all equipment and so on was stored. And when all the discussions of the political parties took place, they told me to get my signal stuff out there, and they started to renovate the whole of the Turenala, which was the place that they used for all the discussions and so on, for the politics and so on. So the Turenala was a signal store, and then it became a political discussion center. So that was also very interesting.
At what point were you promoted to captain? Was that after you left Windhoek?
Yeah, no, I was promoted to captain, like in the Army Gymnasium. We stayed in the rank about 2 to 3 years. And then I was like 28, then I became a major, and 32 I became a commandant, which is a lieutenant colonel, and then 35, 36 colonel.
And it seems an odd transfer from signals to gymnasium. I don't quite get that. How did that?
Yeah, the gymnasium was a signals unit, and there was the School of Signals were part of the Army Gymnasium was the HQ, and they had the School of Signals, 1st Signal Regiment, HQ unit, and a special special services unit, which were the formative branch of the Army that were trained there, and the PT branch as well, which was Army type of units or subunits, and it was under the command of the Army Gymnasium. So
the gymnasium wasn't a place where guys went and jumped over things and swung on ropes. It was
it was an establishment that you can say a mini brigade type of establishment, because it has more than one unit in it. It was a base type of organization.
Right.
It is the Army Gymnasium. Myself and Arnold Tron wrote a book on the history of the signalers in that time. We were there for quite a while, and it was the place where all the troops gathered, about 1,500 troops per intake, and then we trained them in basic training, and then specialized in radio equipment and so on, and then also the leadership training of citizen force and permanent force people.
And did you yourself have to understand and operate in Morse code and the other, obviously the basics and more advanced stuff in signaling?
Yeah, when I was a candidate officer, myself and a candidate officer, Andre van Huisteen, we were sent for the Morse training in 1973. So 1972, 73. So we had a sergeant major that trained us in Morse training at that time. But we never used it because everything was changing with the new equipment coming in at that time.
And were you married and have children on or off base at that time?
Yes, I married in 75, and then I had 2 sons, which grew up in in an army home. They didn't stand inspection and so on, but they traveled all over the place together with me and my wife. So that was.
Did you find? Well, you obviously never had a civilian job after the army, but many guys I've spoken to said the army was invaluable for setting the right parameters and guidelines for even working in civilian jobs. You know, the discipline, the attention to detail, learning how to actually command people as well, to lead them.
I did leave the army in 1979. 1990s. 79. In other words, then I became a tourist guide. Firstly, I trained entrepreneurs. Then I became a tourist guide.
Yeah.
Then I started to train tourist guides. Then I opened training schools. I even managed a hotel school, and eventually I work now for my son, who's got a training establishment. So I had quite a life after the army, and I even was a honorary ranger of the national of the Parks Board for quite a time, and visited all the national parks, and I became a field guide as well.
Gee, that's very interesting.
Taking Land Rovers out and watch animals and so on.
Lovely. And going back to very briefly your army time, were the majority of signals in South Africa Afrikaans or English, or did you have to be fluent in both?
No, we had a lot of English-speaking people as officers, and even when Rhodesia was closed down, some of those officers and NCOs and warrant officers came to South Africa, and they joined us in the Army Gymnasium, and became squadron commanders and warrant officers and so on, working together with us.
And were they trained in Afrikaans, or did they? I mean, most South Africans can speak English quite fluently. Was that a problem at all?
No, it was not a problem. They adapted well, according to me. My secretary as a colonel was even the wife of one of those officers, Mrs. Lotter, and she spoke English and so on, but it wasn't a problem.
Oh, good.
Because it was a dual language type of situation.
Yes, even though I'm half Afrikaans, all I can really say, I learned Afrikaans at school, but 60 years later, it's sort of Goeiemorgen and Baie Dankie is about as much as I can say.
Yes.
But I really respect the Afrikaans people, and I'm very grateful in my heart for what South Africa tried to do for us. It's very sad the way things have turned out for both nations, but God's got a plan. I know something. Yeah,
that's true.
Dietrich, unless you've got anything else you'd like to share, I think we could sort of end it here. How do you feel about that?
No, it's good. Thank you for the opportunity. It's a part of the history, and I think it needs to be recorded. And even if people think that this is secret stuff that were done, eventually all the things came out in the open, and there was even a book written by General Murphy on the electronic warfare after the South African Defence Force, and it was published and so on. Quite an interesting story, because my part was only a very small part.
What's the name of that book, Dietrich?
I'm not sure out of hand, but it's something like electronic warfare in the SADF, something like that.
And what's the title of your book, and where is it available?
It is the Army Gymnasium. I was there. That's the title of the book, and it's available from us itself. We've got an email address, and the people order it from us, and then we send it to them.
We'll put your email address down below, so that's good.
Yeah, we've got a special email address. It's leergims, LEERGIMS @gmail.com.
Excellent.
And so you just send the email there, and then we provide you with a quotation and so on. And yes, we've already sold about more than 100 books.
Excellent. Leer being the Afrikaans word for army, and Gims is your gymnasium, I guess.
Yes, leergims, yeah.
Excellent. Okay, Dietrich, I've really enjoyed this talk, and thank you very much for volunteering to come on board. It's refreshing to have that happen, and it reminds me to tell our audience, please come and give us your story, and please subscribe and press the like button. Dietrich, thank you very much, and all the very best to you, my friend. All the very best for the rest of your life.
Thank you very much, and enjoy life. Okay, bye.
Thank you. God bless. Bye-bye.